Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with James. For everyone out there listening who might not know who you are, you want to introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure, Robbie. Jim Giordano. I'm a professor of neurology and biochemistry and chief of the Neuroethics Studies Program at Georgetown University Medical Center in Washington, D.C. I'm also a senior Stockdale Fellow in Ethics, Technology, and Leadership at the United States Naval Academy, and I serve as executive director for the Institute of Biodefense Research, a federally funded think tank here in the D.C. area.
Okay, which one do you prefer to talk about first?
It's up to you. It's your show. I'm here for you.
Okay, you said biodefense research. So what exactly are we talking about the extensive biodefense research?
Well, there's a couple of different ways we can look at biodefense. First is the idea of public safety against any and all biological risks, harms, or threats, right? So, COVID-19 is a perfect example of, were we prepared? Are we ready for this type of thing? Do we have the resources? And although it was a naturally occurring pandemic, and certainly we recognize there may be more of epidemic proportion or pandemic proportion, the more humanity intrudes upon these ecological spaces in a variety of ways, well, that's always a possibility. But then there's also that we'll call humanity technology interface with the ecology. We need to assess whether or not various microbes or viruses may pose risks. We do particular types of research to assess that risk, and then we have to worry about the relative security and safety in those laboratories should things get out. And then, of course, there's the just definitive risk of things that might be man-made: gene editing, synthetic biology, the use of existing biological agents and or chemicals, and of course, devices. So these are the things that fall under that rubric of biosecurity and biodefense.
I used to just be worried about planetary defense, like an asteroid hitting the planet, and that could just happen at any time, and we could probably not be prepared for it. It could just wipe out all life in a sense. Hopefully we have a warning of it, but I mean, it's kind of just luck. It's like breathing. You don't really think about it. And if you tend to focus in on it, and kind of can drive you mad. I just get a little nervous because I'm starting to realize life is very fragile. Like, I understand where like people go, we're just bags of blood. You can get hit by a car and any of that type of stuff. Yeah, but I mean, when it comes to like global destruction, when I started diving down like the nuclear policy rabbit hole, and they just tell you, oh, it's mutually assured destruction is kind of like what stops everyone from doing it. I'm just like, oh my God, like this is just up to our, like, I guess, perspectives and our minds not to hurt each other or in any other type of way. But you got to look at the vast amount of things that could possibly happen. And where I start to get scared is not really the extinction of like a giant devastation of life, but the mind virus that we all kind of get involved in every single day, whether that's social media, whether that's an actual technological threat. I mean, the pandemic could be an example too. Pandemic, everyone was scared at first. And now you have people that are fighting each other on different sides, whether you're vaxxed or unvaxxed. And in a sense, it's really causing a lot of depression. It's causing a lot of this stuff as well too, where I start to look at like the psychological aspects and what that does to our minds as well too. I used to be afraid of getting COVID because you were just going to die. But what about, they talk about brain fog. They talk about all these other types of things. You start realizing that life is really fragile and something can throw it off balance. Now, in a sense, when it comes to our minds, I think our minds are fragile as well too, even at a grander scale, I would say, because so much can impact our minds. Something that we see could mess us up for the rest of our lives. These things I start to look at a little bit more. It comes in with like, I mean, it goes down a whole rabbit hole. You talk about gene editing. I start thinking they're immediately going to make super elite people. Like that's a threat that's just my mind creating that. But is that a possibility? Sure, maybe, but there's definitely people out there making sure that doesn't happen. But you start realizing all these informations, all these types of sources, and I know I'm ranting, but there's a lot of stuff out there that can literally drive you down different pathways. And you got to hope that it's not going to lead into insanity in some aspects, which makes a person who might be in your position or in some other position that's watching all these global threats or something, it puts you in a hard spot because that can drive you mad. You got to kind of have a sense of humor if you're dealing with a lot of that stuff, because a lot of it is very, very serious. It's a lot of very crucial things that a lot of people don't realize. It's like being in a small town and monitoring like earthquakes or volcanoes, hoping that something doesn't pop up one day on a Monday. It's always on a Monday that throws the whole thing off balance, where you might have to tell people to evacuate.
Yeah, all good points. I mean, there are a couple of things that come to the fore in what you've said. The first is, well, what you might consider to be insanity, someone else might consider to be their sanity. In other words, those things I do that I define to be viable goods for me, well, good enough for me and mine, my kin and kith, that might be stepping on your toes, or worse, that could be literally whacking you over the head. So the idea that, well, I just need to propagate those things that are in defense of what I hold to be valuable, or my lifestyle, or my cultural identities, and not necessarily the same for you. So the nature of that discourse on who's got their finger of the go button, so to speak, well, that becomes a little more complicated, because realistically, I think you have to appreciate that there's no nation state or even individual actors that are out there saying, let's just do some things that are really rotten and bad because they're rotten and bad. That's not why people do things. They do things because they believe that they're good. The big question is, good for who? In what ways? How is that rationalized, justified? And who gets the goodies? And in somebody getting the goodies, is somebody getting the baddies or not getting anything? And therefore the gap between the have and the have nots simply widens. So you're absolutely right. The nature of that discourse, or probably more realistically, the dialectic in terms of theses and antitheses, various positions and standpoints. I mean, it, to be somewhat genteel, we can say it's very, very rich and complicated. And to be less genteel, it's really rough, because you're dealing with perspectives, and those perspectives are ingrained and entrenched. And very often that requires at least compromise, and at best, some level of consensus to agree or disagree where you want to agree and where you want to disagree. So you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot to be concerned about, and there's a lot to worry about. But I think what's also very important is to worry about what's real. Let's not play chicken little games or cry wolf games. There's a lot of real stuff out there. And as you've said, yeah, I mean, we could spend a lot of time thinking about, we're going to get whacked by an asteroid. But the truth of the issue is that what humanity can do to itself and to its ecology represents a far more pressing danger and far more pressing risk and harm than sitting around worrying about something's going to crash in from outer space.
Yeah, but even when I look at like a problem or I try and think of anything, I always look at there's a perspective that I'm not seeing, probably one I just don't understand or one I don't have information on. I think that's the best thing to really tackle anything that you really hear. You hear one thing saying this, you'd be like, okay, well, what's the other side of that? Or what's the and there's stuff that you're not going to know because there's just not information for you to have that. Like, we're not going to know what really happened to Tupac. People say all these other types of things. That's just a funny example. But in a sense, there's a lot of information we don't know. There could be something that he ate that night, something, a bunch of things that could have mattered in a whole different perspectives that you got to look at. I just start looking at like, what's the way to manage it all at scale? You know, what's the way to do, like, we've been running, people want to say, oh, this is a terrible time. This is all this. I'm like, well, we're still here. Like, I mean, as bad as you might want to say, and you can poke blames, and every society, I feel like at any age can poke blames at whatever technology or whatever time. You could always blame a problem on something. But we're still here, and we're still moving forward in a sense as well too. You know, we weren't like we were 1,000 years ago. Each generation, each civilization, each whatever time period you want to say has its own issues that it faces. You're able to look at the problems when you're involved in it and say, this is what we could fix, and that's good. Improvements are good. But I also think you can't just completely, as a person, and I'm just saying the general public, which you see a lot on Twitter or social media or something, there's always somebody complaining about something. Be happy with the things that we do have. We do have technology that is advancing. And in a lot of ways, I am afraid of that, but also I see the benefit in it as well, too, when it comes to medical, when it comes into keeping our lives going forward in a sense of we're innovating and making major strides in scientific innovations. But with that also comes the people that look at something and go, well, we can weaponize it. And then that's when you go, all right, we're going in a different direction. And like you said, it's really, is it good for who? And that's when I start to wonder, like, yeah, Who's running everything? Who's going all
Let
this? And then it leads us
let me
down.
give you a perfectly good example. I mean, so something like let's talk about the low hanging fruit. The low hanging fruit is to develop aspects of science, technology for what you perceive to be doing some good. Probably the most evident good would be, well, how can we use it in medicine, right? How could we affect the human condition, the human predicament of injury, of disease? How can we make our lives better, make ourselves more survivable, enhance our flourishing? All right. I mean, that's pretty much agreeable generally. No one's going to argue with that and go, that's a bad thing. So let's say I develop something very, very simple. We'll use a very, very simple analogy, a scalpel. A scalpel. A lot of things really cool I could do with the scalpel. I could remove tumors with it. I can begin any surgery with it. I can do some complex things with it. I can work from the cosmetic side all the way up to the cancer eradicational side. Right? A lot of things I can do with a simple tool like a scalpel. I can also turn it around. I can cut people to shreds with
Yeah,
it.
that's
I
what I was thinking.
very
That's what I was thinking.
important sacred documents, and I can rip them up. I could essentially go crazy with the thing and carve graffiti into walls and blaspheme. So the exact same tool is really dependent on the tool user, not only for its intent, but also what's called intentional drift. What I want to use it for might not be what you want to use it for. Point number one. Point number two, the longer that something is out there, the more people are apt to use it, the greater the diversity in what they see it might be useful for, either by intent or by innovation. And although there's nothing inherently wrong with innovation, and it's something that we encourage, the directionality, the trajectories of innovation are multifold. And again, my idea of using something that I define to be good might not necessarily fulfill a good for you either. So what's really important here is that level of discourse, is that level of discussion. And we're in an age where information becomes relatively ubiquitous. I mean, podcasts and videocasts such as this, availability of information over the internet, Twitter, Facebook, a variety of other means, and something even as simple as TikTok that gives you, if you will, a glimpse into something like that. It's still a meme. It's still an iconography. It still delivers a message, whether implicitly or explicitly. So we have the means to do this. The question is, then will we use it to our advantage and in those ways that, as you say, are scalable? But then we have to ask the other question. What scale? Local, regional, national, international? Or will we appreciate that ever more we're moving towards some type of globality? But how inclusive is that globality, given the disproportionality of various nations and groups' relative, quote, development in terms of science, tech, socioeconomic development, their ongoing development? Are they developing nations or are they non-developed? And then even within a developed nation, once again, who gets what? So you're absolutely right. I mean, the questions are apparent. The answers field other questions. And what it requires is sort of ongoing engagement, preparedness, and readiness. Will things go wrong? No doubt. Who has the control of that? In many ways, we do. Can things get out of control? No doubt. Are we ready for when things get out of control? Don't know.
I think it's important to think of that it's probably going to get out of control, even just have preparations for when it probably does. I'm not saying that that's intentionally that's where it's headed, but I mean, how many inventions started off with a good aspect to it and then end up getting turned for the worst thing? For instance, people talk about, let's take the concept on the gene editing. Now, if you say gene editing, you're going to be able to edit out a cancer or some type of thing that could be in your gene system to stop your kid, CRISPR or something like that, to stop whatever, have your kid from developing a horrible, hey, your kid might have a little bit of autism with it. We're not saying it's bad, but if you want your kid not to have autism, we can fix that in the womb. That sounds benefit, but people don't just stop there. Some people go, well, I just want my kid to have blue eyes. I want my kid to do this. And then you start picking and selecting kind of your perfect human in a sense. Now that might be a far-fetched idea, but it's just what the I mean, it's my thoughts, but also which one captures the media's attention? I've seen so many articles where a media person goes, neurotech or tech that's going to be involved into your head, like the Neuralink, for instance, going to be used to create super secret warriors or all this type of stuff. Now, is that what it's intended for? No. What's the positives of it? You're going to be able to understand different languages with a device in your head to be able to communicate more effectively and hopefully cross some racial boundaries in a sense as well too when it comes to a language barrier. But people like that weird sci-fi narrative part to it where they start thinking about super electronic weapons or cyborgs or all these other type of stuff. And sadly, you get a billionaire out there that likes that idea and wants to install, like that one dude who's created his own cyborg race where he installed a giant wire to the back of his head that comes up in front of him and is able to sense color or something like that. Like that's a weird direction. And that's where society is like, even the guy from, you ever see the show Black Mirror?
Sure.
Yeah, the guy who was making the show said, "I've stopped making them because society's just too crazy." It's everything that has been on Black Mirror. People go like, "Oh, we're doing that." I mean, that's what is starting to capitalize the market in a sense, and I like that research and innovation stuff. But when does the line get drawn too far? I mean, I start to look at society, for instance, and welcome to Out of the Blanket is what I meant by conversation. Is that it leads down this path where I feel like innovation, we end up forgetting what the line is for morality. Most of the time with government projects, you can see looking at it back, obviously, with now you have foresight or whatever you want to call it. You can look back at it and be like, those are horrible things. It's like, yeah, but imagine being involved in something like that that slowly builds up to that. You don't notice it building up. It's kind of like when you have a kid. Now, you know they're getting bigger, but you don't notice it at scale because you're around them 24/7. And then you have a family member who hasn't seen them in 4 years and go, oh my God, look how big you've gotten. You
No, no,
just,
no, wait, stop. I disagree.
oh,
I disagree wholly with that statement.
okay. Well, that's okay.
I'll
That's
tell
why
you
we
why.
talk. Yeah.
And in transparency, the reason for that is I spend a lot of my time doing work with not only our government, but international governments that are involved in science and tech development. And I have to tell you, there's a dedicated effort to generating that kind of foresight. What you were talking about is hindsight, looking back and go, oh,
Yeah.
how did that happen? Well, that's Monday morning quarterbacking. The idea is not to just Monday morning quarterback. Anybody can do that. The idea is to plan the game on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, so that when you get in there on Sunday, it doesn't go to hell in a handbasket, number one. And number two, recognize that you're sort of playing against other teams and they have their own agenda. They have their own initiatives. And they have their own values, needs that they're looking to sate and engage. So part of the effort more and more is becoming this prospective orientation that allows you to effectively model, game, plan, and understand what things could go wrong, why they could go wrong, and then engage a process which is called gap identification, analysis, and correction. In other words, where are the gaps? Are there gaps in inter and multinational communication? Are there gaps in surveillance? Are there gaps in safeguards and controls? Can certain things be retracted from the market, so to speak? Can other things be recovered if, in fact, damages are incurred? And if those damages are incurred, what's the extent of those damages? What things are recuperable? On what levels are they recuperable? Economically, individually, idiosyncratically, systemically, what? And then the other question is, well, what's forgivable? And that's where things get really touchy, Rob, because if you're talking about forgivability, forgivability has to be able to say, well, X, Y, and Z are forgivable because we got A, B, and C out of it. But then the question asks, well, who got the benefit from A, B, and C? So any one of these engagements on these governmental levels, on a variety of scales, from the national to the multinational to literally these global discourses, have increasingly begun to engage, employ, and sustain ongoing programs that are wholly dedicated to prioritizing that type of forward-looking approach, number one, for gap identification, analysis, and correction. Number two, for readiness and preparedness. In the event, and again, not the likely event, but the probability that the more things are out there, the more drift they have, and the further they may get away from the intended use or application, number one. And number two, the issue really boils down to the fact that humans are diverse. And in human diversity, you have to appreciate diversity of intent and application and use. And that requires some planning. So to simply say that, well, these governmental agencies develop something and then just, quote, let it loose, those days are long gone. I mean, realistically, we've learned an awful lot from the faux pas and in some cases, sticking head in the sand evidences of the past. Does that mean we're not going to make those mistakes again? No, of course it doesn't, because there are those things that are always going to, quote, sneak up on you. The unanticipated unanticipated, so the proverbial unknown unknowns. But part of the mechanism is to have these types of institutions, organizations, working groups in place so they can work not only continuously to be able to have that preparative engagement, but to also work ad hoc so that they can then come together as needed and where needed to be able to address the problem as it's starting to bloom, not necessarily once it's been out there seeded and pollinated a host of other problems. So I disagree and push back very strongly on the idea that, well, these things are sort of happen willy-nilly within governments and they let them sort of loose out into the
No,
world. So
I didn't say that. What I was saying is
no,
that
no, let me finish. And then, but the other issue really becomes, are civic institutions ready for this level of scientific and technological development? In other words, even if we want to use these things in those ways to make, I say, individuals more ethically aware, more moral, more polyglot, and in being polyglot, perhaps more sensitive and sensible towards others' narratives. I mean, literally their narratives. I mean, you talked about sort of an indwelling universal translator. Cool idea, right? Well, the question there are our civic institutions, not just nationally here in the US, but globally, prepared for the capabilities that these scientific and technological advancements, developments, and progress not only could incur, but likely will incur in the near and intermediate future. And I got to tell you, some ongoing work with a good colleague of mine named Professor John Shook, we did a sort of global analysis of what's in place and what isn't. And the take home answer is spot on to what you said. No, civic institutions are not uniformly ready for this. Yeah, there may be some focus on idiosyncratic risk reduction, and that's very, very cool. But systemic risk assessment and risk reduction, and now we haven't gotten there yet. It's a work in progress.
What I was speaking about, I think you might have misunderstood what I was saying. What I was speaking about is not government institutions working willy nilly, doing anything like that. Not institutions in general, even educational institutions not doing that. Those are separate. Those are billionaires. Billionaires can do whatever they want, really, in a sense, as long as it's not a global threat or anything to threat to the public, I would say. What I'm talking about is open transparency. I bet you would have a lot more comfortability with any of these ideas if someone was there to fill in the gaps. For instance, my example would be there was a recent trending hashtag on Twitter called Skynet. And this was like a few months back, but it was trending because a robotics institute created a lifelike robot and it had it moving and they turned it on. This thing had faces. Now, they were involved in that for probably months. So that was like from the start to the end that people saw. They never saw all the gaps in the middle. So when people see that, they immediately jump to the worst conclusion that the world is going to get taken over by robots. So what I'm speaking on is the open transparency aspect. I feel like you'd have a lot more people doing things or having a better reaction to things if there was more information that was given to them about the steps and the progress. But a lot of times this boils down to the concept of what people consider important to tell the public. Like some people don't even think about it because they're so involved into it. Like that's the thing, is that when you're in a group, for instance, if me and you go out and we smoke a cigarette at noon or whatever at the same time every single day, to us that's normal because we've done it for however long. But to a person that's now coming into the group, they're like, what, you guys every day at this time? Like that's weird, because that's not part of their routine. And that's kind of what I'm saying, is like with these institutions, with any of these research things, with anything that goes on in the world, when someone's working towards something or building something or just working on something in general, if you're involved in it, it's normalized to you. And that's kind of what I talk about with the general public. That's why you have such adverse reactions of people when they hear about weaponizing. They always jump to these large conclusions of sci-fi and stuff like that. It's because there hasn't really been a discussion about that topic, because people didn't think, like, oh, I know so many people want to reach out to them. They go, why would you want to talk to me? I'm not that interesting. They're actually very interesting people, but they're just not looking at it because they're involved in it so much that to them, they just don't think that they're interesting. A lot of work out there is very interesting, and it can also turn into scary because people see movies more than they see the open transparency about what people are creating a lot of times as well too. So it causes people to jump to the worst possible conclusions. I think there's a smart regulation going on between all of these things. that people like yourself, for instance, are doing a great service. But we don't see that information that you see every single day. I bet there's probably a lot of things you could tell me, and I would sit there and be like, oh my God, that's the scariest thing in the world, because it's not normal to me because I've never heard of something like that.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think one of the things you also have to appreciate is that the level of transparency, particularly on the commercial side, is very often gated by what may be proprietary interests and intellectual properties, right? So that a commercial enterprise spends years developing something, characteristically, they're not letting, quote, the special sauce out of the jar, because what they're afraid of, and realistically so, is commercial purloinment, commercial theft, idea robbery, intrusions of intellectual property prior to things being developed to a point where it can then be fully patented as an operationalizable or usable entity. So the idea of commercial protectiveness is one of the things that we're seeing, and you're absolutely right, with the rise of what's called billionaire culture and the billionaire innovator cum entrepreneur. Very often what you're seeing is that those economic interests, in some cases, supersede what may be considered the need for ethically sound transparency. Why? Because once again, commercial interest, what's proprietary, what's viewed as intellectual property, fear of intellectual property theft, all come into the fore, right? And then now you're dealing with things like business ethics and business law, point number one. Point number two, and this is something I really applaud you for, is that there is the need for this level of open communication and discourse. In other words, there has to be transparency in terms of what's going on and why it's going on. Now, let me be clear about this. There are certain things, and we keep bringing up sort of implicitly this idea of national security, intelligence, and defense. Well, you know as well as I'm sure, as do your listeners and viewers, that there are certain things that governments do that obviously cannot and should not be released in terms of the information available, because you're essentially cracking open your playbook to your opposing team and still hoping that you're going to try to win the game on Sunday, proverbially. Those spheres of influence and power simply don't work that way. So there are certain things that remain classified, must remain classified, and I would argue should remain classified. But I think it's also critically important to have a well-informed public. You need not get them down into the weeds and the individual blades of grass and that level of granularity. But I think it's very important to tell them what you're working on and why you're working on it, what the goals or intents are. Again, don't give away the secret sauce, so to speak, but please do tell them, that you're spending your Saturdays making your favorite spaghetti sauce, or that you're spending your Friday nights rolling your cigarettes so we can go out for the next week at noon and smoke one. So I think those kind of things are important, because the opportunity for viable information and valuable information also needs to remain apace with, and in some cases directly counter, misinformation that is out there. And I don't mean it's intentional misinformation. I don't want to do the fake news thing. But what I'm saying is that there's a lot of different perspectives, and essentially the public is being bombarded by information. How do they select what is legit and what isn't? What's realistic from what represents those things that are a fantasy? And then you get into the idea of fiction. And I have to tell you, working with a very, very well-known colleague of mine named Dr. Rachel Wertzman, one of the things we've banged the drum very strongly about is the need for ethical discourse about the way contemporary science and tech fiction is being developed and portrayed. Those things that sort of gin up the public to have these artificial worries and or misappropriations and understanding of the science and the tech. Well, there's problems with that in a lot of ways. I think science fiction is wonderful, and I'm a big science fiction fan, but I think as the science actually progresses, and as the capability for information getting more ubiquitously into the public hands equally progresses as a consequence of said science and tech, there is that responsibility for the arts and humanities to depict science and tech in ways that at least have a fundamental kernel of reality and can then spin the story from there, and to dispel, for example, certain urban myths and bring them back to what I'll call realistic truths. Now, there's nothing wrong with taking creative license, as you should. But there have been some very, very good works of literature and certainly great works of film that I can really give a nod to. Let me give you a couple examples. The film Limitless, right? Great film, 100% fictional in terms of the storyline evolution. We don't have a drug that can do that, but it was based upon a realistic orientation to could we utilize a variety of existing drugs as what we call nootropics, in other words, cognitive enhancers. That's real, not to the extent as shown in the film with the fictional NZT drug that Brad Cooper took. But it's also important to understand that limitless is not the drug's effect. Limitless is the desire for those things that are going to make us better, make us optimized, and to remain apace with everyone else who we feel may be optimized. If you're doing it, then I must do it. If I'm doing it, somebody else must do it. That was in a very important film. It serves a role that we carry forward from ancient Greek theater, which is called idola. Eidos in Greek means the essence of the thing. So what you do is you preserve the essence of the issue. You let people know that that's factual, and then you spin the yarn from there in ways that allow the public to appreciate, well, this is a possible trajectory. Things could unwind like this. Let them think about that. I tell you who does that work brilliantly in their writings, many of them have now been incorporated and adapted into film, is the author Michael Crichton. What Michael Crichton does is he puts in the foreword of the book, this is what is real. I based this entire fictional novel upon a spin-off of what is real, but I'm using real situations to be able to explore the, if you will, capability space, probability space, how things might go down and unwind or go wrong. That's brilliant. So what we're calling for is something that you've alluded to, and I think very appropriately so, the need for more transparency in those ways that remain aligned with what the current needs are for security, for safety, but also to keep an informed public, because that informed public is going to represent constituencies of various political figures that are important in supporting policies to guide and govern what gets done, what doesn't get done, and how it's controlled. So I think that the reciprocity of those domains and those dimensions of information and what is shared, what is not, how it is shared, and the ethical responsibility to share things aptly and prudently is really becoming more and more important. So applause for that.
Is there anything that you feel like you've come across that the public probably would have a bad reaction to? Because I think a lot of our bad reactions, like I said, does come with that open transparency, but also comes with it's not just up to date. It's just we're involved in too much of the fantasy aspects of things as well, too. I mean, it's good to think like, oh, this could lead to this, but we jump there really, really quickly. We don't have that slow time or buildup or trust given to the thing that's being created, where I feel like a lot of things that might have been deterred in a sense, like I'm always going to relate to like a government project, but a long time ago, there was psychological warriors like the movie Men Who Stare at Goats. They had that program, Operation Jedi or Project Jedi. I think that might be a real possibility, but did it go bad? Yeah. But when people read it, they think it's more sci-fi than it is. Like people think it's like Star Wars, where we had the Force or something like that. I don't think that's true at all. I think there's maybe some aspects to look up there. That's my own personal, but I kind of look at this aspect like we jump from 0 to 100 very, very quickly. And I feel like there's a lot of things that could be beneficial that we're probably not going to be able to pick up again, or it's just lost in the weeds in a sense, because we're on a different train or a different track because of a public's reaction to something or what the public might think.
To my point, exactly right. I mean, I think there's an increasing need for that level of prudent communication, both in terms of what is factual and what is fictional. I mean, good fiction can serve a role. Good fiction can serve a preparatory role, an awareness role, an arousal role. It can create particular social attitudes in a variety of good ways. And it's important to indicate and illustrate that that's fictional, that this represents a fictional approach to X, Y, or Z that has the exact intent to doing that. Let me give you an older example. I mean, a very older example. I'm going to date myself now. I mean, obviously, I grew up during the 1960s. I mean, the first movie of The Planet of the Apes, the one with Charlton Heston, That was a social message. You went through this whole really interesting science fictional romp about intelligent apes and sort of reverse evolution, and wow, that was a head scratcher. And then you get to the very end of the movie, and what you're actually confronting is the reality of the possibility for thermonuclear destruction, which that was at the height of the Cold War, and what that might then mean for not only the balance of political power, which is in front of our noses when we're thinking about those things, but the balance of ecological hegemony, the balance and leverage that it has over environments, ecology, writ small and writ large, a real social message there. In other words, be careful with what you're doing. Measure twice, cut once. I use that phrase all the time in my lectures and my podcasts. So yeah, good fiction can do a couple of different things. It can illustrate good science and tech fact and spin a good fictional yarn in a way that's going to be meaningful to get people to think about these things in certain ways. It can also illustrate where various strengths and weaknesses are and what the tensions may be. But the other thing I think becomes important to understand is to really differentiate and make that distinction where the facts are and what is fiction. Because what you said was absolutely correct, and it goes the other way as well. You can look the other way down that pipe, where people think that fiction is fact, and they confuse what is fact with fiction. Both of those scenarios can be problematic for a number of different reasons on individual and social levels. So yeah, that ongoing communique between what we're doing scientifically and technologically in the factual domain and how those things are being depicted, inclusive of the attitudes and values that may be depicted individually, socially, communally, commercially in good fiction, well, that gets pretty rich. And I think that the time for doing that and moving in that direction is now.
Do you think that people's idea of what a threat might be off on what the concept of the threat that they should be focused on really is? The reason why I say that is I feel like a lot of people are more worried about like, well, right now it's probably nuclear destruction. I see that trending all the time, but I don't think that's really a fear a lot of people are worried about in an aspect of it actually coming to fruition. But people look at like they're not worried about what's in their food, for instance, like crops and insecticides. That's, I mean, important for a lot of reasons as well too. But some companies do cut corners, and we have like what Monsanto's is, where you start realizing there's a lot of people suffering from effects of these insecticides. And I've talked to a few people who've studied it on my show, and you start realizing the health effects that cause into it. And we just basically release this. Another example would be like phthalates in plastics. There's all that's going on. That's a real threat that I feel like now is starting to be looked at in a sense that also I feel like with the general public, that also leaks into institutions as well too. A lot of people weren't worried about researching plastic in our bloods and these things called phthalates until just recently that I know of, at least it became aware to the public. It might have been going on longer than that, but that's a real fear. Making people sterile or infertility counts dropping, that's a real extinction fear. But I feel like a lot of people are more worried about like the thing that they can see, which is something they see on television, Russia or whatever they want to say. I think in a sense, general public, that's a fear, sure. But I feel like there's threats that we're really completely not paying attention to because we're so honed in and focused on one general aspect of where something is going.
Yeah, and it's a good point. And I think that the yardstick there is the construct of proportionality. Right? I mean, if we understand that there's a lot of things out there that can go bump in the night, proverbially, right? I mean, we'd never leave the house. Not only would we never leave the house, we'd be so worried about all the things we have in our household, we'd be afraid to take a step or a breath. And I mean, there's some legitimacy to that. I mean, we're surrounded by those things on a variety of scales in our environment, from the very personal to the socio-political, from the individual to the international. It could really mess us up. No doubt, no doubt at all. The question is, well, what do we worry about? All of it? To what extent? Which is really where the idea of proportionality and perception and proportionality and preparedness comes in. I mean, we have to be able to prioritize certain things in terms of their relatedness and relativity. And their relativity to who, right? Well, first and foremost, to me, to my kin and kith, but then we need to have more of a citizenship idea about, well, what's going on that's going to affect the all boats in terms of the rising or sinking tide. Right now, there are concerns about will our transatlantic peer competitor or adversary go nuclear in this engagement in the Ukraine. The truth of the issue is that at relatively high circles, it's not so much a concern of whether or not these will be weapons of mass destruction in terms of what used to be considered large scale intercontinental ballistic missiles or more tactical use of missiles, but things like controlled nukes, nukes with limited radius of effect, localizing radiological effects. In other words, the idea of dirty bombs, for example, or quote, baby nukes. So what happens is the science and technology changes, and you also have to then change the appropriate level of concern and in consideration what's going on. You're absolutely right about the demonstration and elucidation of microplastics in the blood. Part of what becomes important to appreciate is that as we develop new technologies for assessment, we can then better understand how the technologies, methods, tools, and techniques we've had prior have affected us. The question then is, are we going to remain flexible enough, self-considerate enough, self-revising and correcting enough to act upon that knowledge in appropriate ways? All right, there are microplastics conspicuously distributed in blood samples in the US and worldwide. What are we going to do about that? Now, the other question is, who has to worry about what? I mean, in some cases, it sort of falls back to some maxim of the desiderata. In other words, give me the courage, if you will, to fix those things I can, and the fortitude and strength to not necessarily worry or deal with those things that I can't. So it very often turns into, well, what are my levels of capability and control? And I think an important consideration that goes along with that is that forums such as this and others, and a variety of other methods for individual access to public discourse are increasing, which means that individuals' views and voices can be seen and heard more widely. So it really is a question of asking individuals, what concerns you? What do you want to affect? Can you affect that? And if not, why not? And if so, how so? And if the answer is no, you can't, is that something that can be done about it or not? And if the answer is no, is this something you need to be concerned about? Or should you make the necessary inroads to begin to be a change agent in some way through constituency, participation, et cetera? So the points you make are spot on. But the thing that I look to avoid is creating sort of this public perception of be worried about everything. There's a lot of stuff out there to be worried about. And I think what becomes important is to look not only in the lens of what's out there that could be burdensome, risky, harmful, and threatening, but to turn that lens around into a mirror and say, all right, now what do I choose to affect? What worries me with regard to those things that I may be able to change? And what am I going to do about those things that I can't? So again, taking personal responsibility on a variety of levels, again, from the local all the way to what I would consider global citizenry, is becoming more important as we become more globally connected through forums just like this.
I look at like even this show, Joe Rogan, for instance, any of these independent platforms that do leave an open discourse, I do look at that as like a world threat as well, too. In a lot of aspects, it's a threat to business for sure, for a lot of corporations as well, too. But I look at it as an aspect is I can sit here and I can ask you, what's the biological thing that's going to kill us all, a weapon or this type of thing? And I could just aim the whole show in that direction. It can make you feel uncomfortable in a sense as well, too. But I think a better issue as a host and as my own personal perspective is to talk about what can be done to handle the vast amount of information that's out there as well, too. I think that anything that I say, I incentivize people to go look up information or go to multiple different sources and try and gather as much information as possible. But what really sells and what you see top trending shows do is they make it like drama, like Jersey Shore. They make something that gets people to go lead right back into it. That's a nation crisis. It is entertaining. It is fun. It doesn't mean you're going to go and spray tan yourself or do anything like that, but it does lead to a sense of it riles people up. And then after a while, it heads you in a direction of heading down to the 0 to 100 type scale where you start experiencing this. We all know people that you meet them and they're just immediately on level 10. They're like ramped up. Everyone experiences it while they're driving, for instance, because you're psychologically not paying attention to. You're in a moving vehicle that you could basically die if someone makes a mistake, and that causes your life to be in someone else's hands in a sense. But you got to lead down this idea or this direction where I'm trying to go is that there's risk everywhere. I'm aware of that. But what are the ones that people should prioritize and focus on? Because right now, what people are worried about was COVID. Now it's about, are they getting the correct information? I'm worried about that too. But I feel like now people are all focused in on Russia as well too. But what I'm worried about is an aspect of if there isn't this open discourse, which I see as the main problem, if there isn't this communicative aspect, whether it's good and bad, I'd rather you give me $1 million and also bring a pile of shit in the other, because I want to know what both options are. Because I think that's very, very important and crucial to building one of the key aspects that helps society grow in a sense, and that is trust. You trust when you trust people and you have that open line of trust, you get more things done. And I feel like right now, the main issue that it might be the leading to our inevitable kind of, I wouldn't say execution or in a sense, I would say more of just a hindrance in progress that might revert us back a couple of steps is that trust aspect. There's a lot of people that don't like the information and they start to cherry pick. I don't have anything where I'm so I guess biased on where I would be like, it's 100% this. I don't care what information you show me. I'm not like that at all. I would talk to anyone and anyone. But you look at this aspect of people really, with all the information out there, start to want to cherry pick. Now, I don't want to censor. I don't want to limit any information. I think anybody should have the right to speak and everybody should do whatever they want to say. But I feel like if you're a person who's listening, you shouldn't run off with that information. You should start going to multiple fountains of information and start trying to sort through the information yourself. But that critical thinking aspect seems to be a lost art. I'm not saying I do it 100% right either, but I try my best at it. I try to make sure if I hear something or if I talk to someone, they tell me something, I go to multiple aspects of things. I think that's what leads you to a society where you have to have institutions or you have to have all these defense systems in place to monitor what is going on, because people don't want to be aware of it themselves. And it's not their job to be aware of every danger. But it is important to know that these things are out there as well, too. And that doesn't mean stay inside your house forever. That just means know that there's someone out there who is paying attention to that. That's important. That'll keep you sane.
Yeah, there's a lot in what you said. I
I'm
mean,
sorry.
to be sure. I mean, it was very rich. I mean, there's a lot of there in what you're talking about. And just to dissect that a bit in ways that I think are very important, or very often what people seek in information are things that reinforce their existing beliefs, right? They resonate with those things. There is a responsibility that comes along with being in the public eye. I fully believe that. I believe that there's a responsibility to engage certain levels of trust. And I think there's also a responsibility when you're in the public eye to be very clear about your what's called veridicability. In other words, are you being 100% truthful, or are you presenting a distinct perspective? Understand, as you well said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with presenting a perspective. I mean, we live in an open society. This is an open democracy. And in an open democracy, those multidimensional perspectives are something that are relatively sacrosanct. I mean, we defend those aspects of the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I would argue, rightly so, because that allows the level of discourse. But one of the things that has happened is that's become so polarized that very often individuals and groups don't want to even accommodate what may be views or perspectives that are in some way anathema to their own. It becomes important to understand those views and perspectives in real dialectic. In other words, what's there, what's not. and do so in a realistic way. What are the facts? What facts are known? What facts aren't known? And what do we do about that? What that promotes is a deeper understanding of the realities of situations. Narratives are exceedingly effective because narratives feed into individual and groups psychological and behavioral consonants, what they hold to be right and true, and dissonance, those things that give them heartburn. But being able to essentially see that playing field, well, I think there is a strong responsibility that goes along with any and all individuals who present in the public forum, such as you. Again, I have no problem with someone coming on the air and saying we're going to be orienting and presenting this perspective alpha, perspective bravo, Charlie, etc. But be explicit in that, and be explicit in the fact that that represents a viable perspective and a perspective that I and those people who listen to me may value. It doesn't discount the reality, possibility, or plausibility of other perspectives, but rather might invite that discourse. But I think it's always important to really get a good view of the proverbial playing field. I mean, any playing field. This is not new philosophy. This is old. This comes from Sun Tzu. This comes from Aristotle. This comes from the work of even someone like Descartes, a cognitive thinker who talks about being able to appreciate the entirety of the cognitive space. Important things to do. So I think what we have here is not only the challenge that you've well addressed in terms of what do we do given this preponderance of information and relative funneling, the capacity or possibilities for it to develop what we sometimes call looking through a straw thinking, but we also have a real opportunity. It goes back to looking at gaps and trying to understand why they're there and correcting those gaps. And if one of the gaps is this multi-perspectival orientation that is very clear, explicit, and responsible, about saying this is my position, I hold these values near and dear, you're entitled to yours. Again, it's an old maxim. It's something of an Ignatian maxim. What I freely assert, you are perfectly free to so essentially refute. What I freely assert, you may freely decline. What that really forces me to do is to defend my case, and to defend my case in a way that's not ad personam. It's not Jim against Rob, Rob against Jim.
Are we disagreeing that much?
No, not at all.
Oh, okay.
The idea of saying, well, okay, we're not disagreeing at all to my view. But it's the idea that, okay, entertain that Rob has a perspective and Jim has a perspective. It's not the person necessarily. It's what are those ideas and those beliefs? Again, what I freely assert, others may freely deny. Defend your case, but do so in a way that is responsible and, here comes the big one, respectful. And I think your point about building trust, I think part of the idea of building trust is there's also been something of a dissolution of respect, personal respect, professional and positional respect. And I really think we need to get back to that level of respect, because I think that's fundamental to ethical discourse and building trust, that engaging in that discourse is not going to in any way be a disrespectful entertainment or a disrespectful exercise, but rather is going to be one that's responsible and hopefully productive, at least in some ways.
When you talked about players on the field, I look at the example of like pieces on a chessboard. We're playing a chess game, or we're headed in the direction of playing a chess game where it's already starting missing pieces. Like there's a lot of elimination of perspectives as well too, which I have an issue with. Like it boils down to the censorship thing. But also we have a lot of companies and a lot of businesses and a lot of main things. That's why I like for instance, I mean, you could give me an example about the institute you work at as well too. Are there a bunch of people that have conflicting opinions and perspectives? Because I think that's important. See, a lot of companies, a lot of businesses, they eliminate perspectives by having a bunch of yes men at their table, where you have an issue when you do address something or you do bring something across. Now, I'm not saying yours is. I'm just saying that's what in a lot of things people can point, be like, that's what that led to. It's because I mean, a giant CEO of a business and a bunch of people, that one dude has all the power. People don't want to refute that person, but I feel like you should look to that. I like a lot of people that don't really agree with me. And in a sense, people can agree with me. I don't really have anything that I don't really, like I said, I wasn't really biased on one thing, but I think that's how a Theranos slips through, where you have someone that capitalizes on a really beneficial thing, which is gene editing, even though you can think of all like the worst things as well too with it. But I mean, if we use it in a positive aspect, it might help out in some sense. Not saying we need to 100% focus in on that, but I'm saying it could help. But you have a Theranos that starts robbing people on their money by giving them false diagnoses on things. I think you don't have people thinking of something like that happening, not because it's never been done before. We all know about like a Bernie Madoff or something like that, but it's because you're too focused in on one perspective and you're not looking at the whole board, which is I always think is important. It's not really I wouldn't say critical thinking. I think it's just being aware of other things that are out there. That person that has that, like I like conspiracy theorist people only because they're thinking of something I could never possibly think of. Like that's way out of left field. Like, where did you get that from? But it's good to have them at the table as well, too, to just hear their perspective, because you can trace small things that, hey, they might be correct. Hey, they might be on this part, or they didn't get all of it right, but they got this part of it. They were just off about the earth being flat. Now, those perspectives we can joke and we can laugh, but in a sense are valid as well too, because they enhance your own perspective by being aware of what everyone else is thinking of as well too. And I think that helps solve future problems as well too.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the information can lead to knowledge, and knowledge leads to capability. The more knowledgeable you are, the more multi-perspectival you are in that orientation and appreciative of those perspectives and why those perspectives exists. Well, that's not only informative, that can be instructional, because what that allows you to do is to see into the thing, if you will. I mean, really gain insight to it and why it exists, rather than just being dismissive of it. Understand how those ideas developed, percolated, been sustained, and then what becomes important to understand about what those ideas then generate in terms of the way those cognitions fuel emotions, those emotions fuel behaviors, and then consequences of behavior. So it's all part of a larger quasi-calculus that I think is very important, which then goes back to your earlier point, which I agree with 100%. The need for transparency for trust. In other words, transparency in trust. Again, it becomes very important to be transparent about what you're being transparent about. We can tell you about A, B, and C, but we can't tell you about D, E, and F. But we can't tell you about D, E, and F for these reasons. And these reasons generate what is sometimes referred to as the because clause. And one of the things I can tell you as a neurocognitive scientist for the past 4 decades is that individuals and groups respond very positively to the because clause. It provides them orientation to not only their self-rationalization of an idea, a concept, a problem, but others as well. Others construct rationalization, legitimacy of that thing, whatever it may be. So it allows appreciation of, once again, the proverbial playing field. Why is it that these other guys who are out there running around are hitting me at 15 to 20 miles an hour with as much force? Because they want to win that game, and we're playing rugby or football or whatever, or we're playing chess. And sometimes in chess, pieces get eliminated as the rules of the game. But what becomes important to that point is the old maxim of nothing about us without us. If those corporate, scientific, technological, and governmental and political decisions are about individuals and groups that are not on that chessboard, then there is a responsible obligation to get those proverbial pieces back onto that chessboard, so then they can, in fact, leverage their values, their needs in that game. So I think one of the things that is becoming increasingly important is to understand what those relationships are and examine those power relationships in terms of what are the responsibilities to those individuals who may have minimal opportunity for representation, so that we can then opportunize and empower those individuals to be more valid and valuable players, if you will, in that game or in that enterprise.
Do you think we're headed in that direction as a society? Because I feel like with the way that like Netflix and people are like, I just want to take a nap and all that, it seems like we don't really act until we're in that red line, which is what I give the example for when people talk about like the world's going to end tomorrow because of the climate. Now there's a problem, there's a climate issue, but there's a lot of people that'll show you like, hey, this not 2100 is what they're saying. There's a lot of questions about that. That's a very skeptical thing. And I think that's where the trust thing starts as well, too. You have to be upfront and rational, but sadly, we're in a society where we're all fourth quarter people. A lot of people are fourth quarter people. They like to act that last, like score six touchdowns in the last quarter when the rest of the game they were lagging. And I feel like that's not a good way to be. And I just wonder how long are we going to wait till the red line, I would say, until we start to take action? Is that going to be something we prioritize preparedness? I think with this pandemic, for instance, we're not going to be prepared for the next one. We're not going to be, if there is a next one, we're just not prepared as people because we're still focused and worrying about this one. Now, I think to form a better strategy and a better plan to be able to recover, to be able to handle, is to think about these possible scenarios, not to freak out about it and elitist it, but to make it in a scenario where you're worried about preparation. Better ventilation right now would be a great one instead, too. You know, fixing that issue. There's a lot of things that you can fix that can help build up to the main problem in an act of preparedness. Now, having better strategies and methods, that's not like overthinking. That's just being aware that there's a possible small percentage maybe that it could lead to this. And I feel like that's a more effective way. And that's what is important about your job as well, too. And any other job out there that happens to do with ethics or all these other things, I'm happy those are out there. I just started finding out about those. I've been like, oh, I've been focused into Google stealing all of our data and information in cyber warfare, which is what the general public usually sees in an article. But when you start realizing there's lawyers and efficacy people that are paying attention to this stuff as well too, it starts to be like a safety net where I'm like, thank God there's a little bit of preparedness. Now, can we expand that a little bit more? I think the general public should be open to that aspect of it as well too. I don't think that means more regulations on people. I just think that they should be understanding what's going on. Like, hey, you saw this clickbait article. Let's show you this thing over here where it's going to be like a document, CIA judge paper, whatever you want to call it. It's going to be in lawyer speak, but it's letting you know that yes, there are people paying attention to this. That's a giant weight off my shoulders.
So a few things. You're absolutely right. I think one of the things that's lacking, particularly domestically, is a very viable strategic plan. I mean, again, I'm not advocating we shift over to some kind of authoritarian enterprise in government, but we don't have a durable strategic plan. I mean, the closest we come to that is to uphold and sustain the Constitution, which is perfectly fine. I mean, I took that oath 30 odd years ago and was in uniform to do so, and it's noble and it's realistic. However, as the globe changes, as balances of capability and power change, as various hegemonies shift in different domains, the question then becomes, well, what's the plan? What's the strategic plan? Which I think harkens back to the analogy of chess. Even if we're using an analogy of football or rugby, this is relatively timed. There are periods, there are quarters. You're slapping the clock on a chess game, and ultimately someone, quote, wins in a chess game. Perhaps we need to rethink that. Our Trans-Pacific peer competitor, for example, their national game, their cultural game is a game called Go. Unlike chess, it's not a question of who wins, but rather what are the shifting capabilities that afford advantage under different circumstances and situations as the game evolves. So it's a question of establishing relative advantages and advantageous positioning, both in the tactical sense, as well as an appreciation for the strategic sense. We, domestically in the United States, tend to work very tactically in 4-year epochs that are aligned with and consistent with political terms, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, depending on what the level of politics is we're dealing with. But very often, as those terms shift, there are also, many cases, sea changes in what becomes national prioritizations, agendas, instantiations, and initiatives. All well and good to have that level of tactical flexibility. But the other question is there something more strategic that allows us to say these tactical flexibilities are oriented towards this fixity of strategic purpose? Hence, a game like Go perhaps is a little more viable, a little more valuable as an analogy for what's becoming the 21st century world stage and the need for preparedness readiness in playing, if you will, those enterprises that are necessary to be able to leverage capability, in some cases, exercise power and hegemony, and in other cases, govern, guide, and restrict certain domains of power and exercise in ways that are beneficial for as many as possible.
Hmm. Ah, man, I don't know. As soon as you said politics, I just look at like that just
Oh,
changes
no, I know. I know.
it brings in so many different aspects of like what gets prioritized and what doesn't. It always shift changes on that aspect of things. One person thinks this is more important, the
I
other
mean,
person
and,
doesn't.
and, and we and I'm not a politician, and
Yeah,
we could spend hours, and I think there
yeah,
are
no
others who
thanks.
are far more appropriate to discuss politics than I am. I'm just a humble science guy. But I think our conversation was a good one because it also brings to the fore, as you've well done, the need for an informed public, the need for, quote, the educated consumer on that individual of the citizen. And the way to do that is to be far more responsible in the way things are communicated, inclusive of things being communicated politically. So, yeah, right on.
Well, I appreciate you for doing this podcast with me. I'm sure it wasn't the way you
Thank you.
thought it was going to be
No,
going.
it was great. It was,
Uh,
I loved it. Thanks very much. And thanks for your interest in my work, and keep up the good work yourself.
I'd love to have you back as well too. But is there a place where people can find you? Any of your links, if you have any social medias, any websites that you want to say, I can link it in the description
Yeah,
as well
sure. I
too.
mean, they can go to my website. They can go to my faculty page at Georgetown, and that's at www.georgetown.edu, and then just punch in my name, Dr. James Giordano. Or they could go to our website at the Institute of Biodefense Research, and that's biodefense.org, instituteofbiodefense.org. So, yeah, absolutely.
I'll make sure I link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for listening to this episode
Pleasure's been mine. Keep up the good work. See
of
ya.
Out of the